Michelle.
Thank you for that, Valerie. And I want to thank you all for coming today. And I want to thank you, Valerie, for organising the Tennyson talks and for inviting me to speak. Okay, so this paper revisits the complex ways in which Tennyson figures geology in his two major mid-century poems, The Princess and Maud, and it offers new readings of key sections from the poems. The geological focus will be Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, published in 3 volumes between 1830 and 1833, but also Lyell's Travels in North America, Volume 1, published in 1845, which following the work of Michael Taylor, I'll discuss later. So the new readings look at how the Princess and Maud figure Lyell's writing on the role of running water in the geological system. And in exploring this theme, the paper will also think about how the poems deal with geological time and the challenge Lyell's geology presented to 19th century mindsets geared towards natural theology and a teleological way of seeing the Earth's history as a narrative. But I want to start with a little bit of biography. Excuse me. The period between 1830 and 1850 marks the time when Tennyson was working on The Princess and In Memoriam and formulating ideas for Maud. It was also the time in which Tennyson read and assimilated Lyell's geology, and when he would have had been exposed to Lyell's extensive writings on the role ascribed to water in the geological system. Water, we know, as Tennyson's biographer, Robert Bernard Martin, reports, was somehow Tennyson's favourite element. His fascination with water predates his reading of Lyell, although water appears to take on a more specific significance as a result of Lyell's writings. But Tennyson didn't only write about water, fresh water, salt water, seas, rivers, lakes, spring waters, and so on. He also put a great deal of faith in the medicinal qualities of water. He was one of a number of Victorians, including Charles Darwin, who believed in the curative power of water and who took the water cure, known as hydropathy or later as hydrotherapy. And there isn't room to cover the history of hydropathy in this paper, but it's a really interesting topic that has a strong geological connection in terms of the medicinal benefits associated with natural springs and spa water, and the close connection between early amateur interests in geology and the locations of spas, as well as the activities such as hiking that were encouraged as part of the water cure. Tennyson's father, his uncle and aunt were all regular visitors to spa resorts that offered water cures. In April 1822, when he was only 13, his father, whose drinking had become a serious problem, went for the water cure to Cheltenham, where his brother Charles was already taking the waters. The spa at Cheltenham, like others at this period, offered facilities for hot and cold bathing and therapeutic sweat baths, as well as for drinking the spa water. In the summer of 1826, Tennyson's elder brother Frederick wrote to their grandfather asking for money to take Alfred to Skegness so he could try the effect of sea bathing to cure his illness. And as Tennyson grew older and between bouts of ill health and much sofa surfing in the 1840s, he's recorded as intermittently seeking the water cure for largely unspecified ailments in Birmingham, Cheltenham, and at Malvern in the late 1840s. Cold water treatments were thought to revive the body's circulation, and drinking water was also thought to assist the kidneys and the bowels and generally purify the organs. Hydropathy itself worked from the idea that disease could be treated using large quantities of water, both externally and internally. Treatments entailed the external application of cold water, baths and douches, wet blankets and sheets, rubbing combined with drinking large quantities of water, a plain diet, abstinence from alcohol and other stimulants, and rigorous long walks. Except for the long walks, which Tennyson frequently took all through his life, it doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that would appeal to him, known for his pipe smoking, his partiality to a bottle of wine a day. But clearly Tennyson had faith in the curative powers of water. His first proper treatment seems to have been in 1843, after the Tennyson family moved to Cheltenham, where Tennyson spent around 6 months on and off at the hydro in the nearby village of Prestbury. Much later, in 1847, Tennyson corrected the proofs of the Princess while undergoing hydropathy in Birmingham, and then later that year at Malvern, where he completed the first draft of In Memoriam. Exactly what it was that Tennyson was hoping to cure is not clear, but it seems likely that it had to do with his dread of inheriting epilepsy and the mental instability, the bad blood, which Tennyson's father exhibited, which plagued other male members of the family. Tennyson's younger brother, Edward, for example, was committed to an asylum in York in 1833 and remained there for the rest of his life. Before the introduction of hydropathy establishments, water had been used as a way of subduing patients in mental institutions. Andrew Scull, in his book Anglo-American Psychiatry in Historical Perspective, writes about how immersion in cold water was used to subdue patients as a form of aquatic shock treatment. Practices included the sudden total immersion of patients in cold water, sometimes to the point of near death. As Claire Fenton notes, this was thought to kill the mad idea in the patient. Excuse me a moment. Sorry. Mental illness, of course, carried a significant stigma, and epilepsy, which was never openly admitted by the family, carried a specific stigma in its association, as the 18th century physician Samuel Gugos Tissot had suggested, with sexual disorders and excessive masturbation. As Martin claims, while a cure for epilepsy was rare, there were many forms of attempted alleviation. Hard walking and exercise were thought to ward off attacks. Water taken internally or externally, baths, showers, spinal douches, and swimming were highly recommended. And all, of course, were traditional recommendations to adolescents to rid their minds of sexual thoughts. It isn't my intention to make biographical inferences from these details, although there are probably some that can be made, but instead to explore the connection between Tennyson's perception of water as powerfully curative, both externally and internally, water's perceived ability to purify the body and stimulate circulation, as well as to ward off epilepsy and sexual disorders, and his understanding of Lyell's descriptions of the destructive and reproductive role water plays in the geological system and how water operates to keep the earth in a healthy balance. And these connections become clearer when parts of the Princess and Maud are read in terms of the geological function of water. Tennyson's water treatments came after his reading of Lyell and coincide with his writing of In Memoriam, and most importantly, The Princess, with its geological expedition, its pivotal scene at the cataract, where Ida reflects on geology's vision of time, and in more playful terms, where her fit of temper leads to her falling into the cold water of the river. The period between 1830 and 1850 was also one of general instability for Tennyson, marked not only by the death of Arthur Hallam in 1833, but also his father's death in 1831, the relinquishing of the family home in Somersby in 1837, his mother's relocation to Tunbridge Wells in 1840, and his cancelled engagement to Emily Selwood, also in 1840, all of which resulted in a period of restlessness, uncertainty about the future, and a sense of having broken irrevocably with the past. It was a period in which Tennyson, like the speaker of In Memoriam, could be said to wander on a darkened earth, to wander on an earth that no longer contained the loved Hallam, and an earth subject to continual and irrevocable change, as so much of what had seemed solid and familiar to him had been lost. But the darkened earth of In Memoriam also describes a poetic landscape, darkened in consequence of it being perceived through Lyell's geology. Lyell's principles of geology, it's now become almost banal to report, offer Tennyson a view of the earth as indifferent to human concerns, an earth that had gone through numberless changes with no human consciousness to witness those changes. More than this, however, the earth, ostensibly the most stable entity upon which all human life plays out, in Lyellian terms, was shown to be intrinsically unstable. It's one thing for geology to reveal that the solid landscape hasn't always appeared as it does now, but it's quite another to learn, as Lyell so convincingly taught, that the landscape is in constant flux in the present, that the earth is continuously shifting geological materials and altering its shape. But in effect, as Darwin noted when reading Lyell, nothing, not even the wind that blows, is so unstable as the level of the crust of this earth. A notion imagined in the much quoted line from In Memoriam, the hills are shadows and they flow from form to form and nothing stands. They melt like mist of the solid lands, like clouds they shape themselves and glow. To get readers to see the earth in these terms, Lyell had to recalibrate their perception of time to enable them to begin to grasp what John McPhee much later would term deep time. The vast, timeless timescales needed to allow for the profound change that geology posited weren't entirely new, but Lyell was the first writer to graphically demonstrate via multiple practical examples drawn from observable evidence how the examination of processes taking place in the present revealed the immense quantities of time that the earth had been in existence. Lyell quoted the 18th century Scottish geologist William Hutton, who in his 1795 theory of the earth had come to the dramatic conclusion that in the economy of the world, I can find no traces of a beginning and no prospect of an end, a declaration that Lyell suggests was all the more startling when coupled with the doctrine that all past changes on the globe had been brought about by the slow agency of existing causes. What emerges from Lyell's development of Hutton's approach is firstly the view that geological research could shed no light on issues concerning the original state of the earth, that it couldn't illuminate first causes, that in fact geology seemed to point to the awe-inspiring magnitude of cycles that the human mind can't relate to, basically. This presented a challenge to the orthodoxy embodied in William Paley's natural theology, with its premise that the study of nature revealed divine forethought. Lyell's cycles of change interrupted natural theology's teleological narrative, leaving the observer of geology instead to wander on an earth that offered no cessation from the aimlessness of time cycles. As Lyell writes, when the thoughts have wandered through the interminable periods of geological time, no resting place was assigned in the remotest distance. let me just, I don't need my PowerPoint yet. The second challenge is found in Hutton's formulation that all past changes on the globe have been brought about by the slow agency of existing causes, a way of seeing geological change that Lyell took up in his methodology that came to be known as uniformitarianism. Lyell's uniformitarian axiom, the present is the key to the past, was meant to sum up his argument that we need only look at processes now in operation to comprehend how change was effected in the past. Often overlooked, Lyell's focus on the present is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his geology. The conservative Victorian sensibilities, heavily invested in a univocal narrative of history and deeply committed to the authority of the past, prioritizing the present in any epistemology definitely could be seen as destabilizing. Prioritizing the present undermines the hierarchy of the past embedded in teleology, and instead energizes and empowers the notion of change in the present. And it was Tennyson's tacit sense of the radical shift Lyell's uniformitarian approach presented, and its wider meaning beyond geology that informed both In Memoriam and Maud, and that makes them so rich in terms of their interrogation of geology's wider implications. Reading Lyell probably compounded Tennyson's already entrenched sense of being unfixed and destabilized, of being in a present in which the narratives of self, like the wider narratives of natural theology, are lost in Lyell's endless and non-progressive focus on present process. Thus, for example, In Memoriam's speaker feels his way through the Lyellian landscape, in which the past and future are cancelled out and replaced by repetitive cycles occurring in the present. Not all of this is new, but it's important for understanding how the princess, which is structured by different geological ideas from Lyell's, works nevertheless to accommodate Lyell's cycles, how it offers to light Lyell's darkened earth with its configuration of a geologically constructed transcendental teleology, which the poem imagines in terms of the role of running water in the geological system. So water in its many forms is a major agent of geological change, particularly in terms of its power to erode and transport eroded materials, levelling the land on the one hand and raising it up in the accumulation of debris on the other. Lyell writes extensively on the role of water in the geological system, and he offers numerous practical examples of water's function. Water erosion also plays a crucial part in terms of Lyell's argument for uniformitarianism, because unlike the intermittent and locally catastrophic effects of earthquakes and volcanoes, it offers a chance for the observer to see geomorphology occurring in a largely uniform, sustained and consistent manner in the present. The erosive action of water, for the human observer at least, is largely imperceptible, and yet it results in the most radical change conceivable, and as it continually forms and reforms the relationship between the land and sea in ways that can only be comprehended by huge imaginative leaps. Lyell discusses the power of even a small rivulet when swollen with rain in removing heavy bodies. He marvels at the rapidity with which even the smallest streams hollow out channels in soft, destructible soils. Water is deceptive. It's apt to mislead the human observer who sees little change in human time and therefore fails to comprehend the immensely destructive force that even a small rivulet represents. Thus, it was water erosion that best illustrated Lyell's uniformitarianism, because it demonstrated the immense power over time of small actions operating with consistency in the present. Okay, So let me put my PowerPoint on for a moment. Whoops, gone a bit too far there. Can everybody see that? Is that okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. So, while water is featured throughout Lyell's writing, he specifically devotes 8 chapters of volume 1 of Principles to explaining the power of water in its many forms, in sections that include such headings as the destroying and transporting power of running water, the action of running water continued, the difference between the transporting power of springs and rivers, the reproductive effects of running water, the formation and destruction of islands, remarks on the interchange of land and sea, the destroying and transporting effects of tides and currents, the actions of tides and currents continued, the reproductive effects of tides and currents. And from these subtitles alone, a pattern of destruction and reproduction emerges. Water erosion has a dual effect. It is ruinous in its erosive and in its erosiveness as it erodes even the hardest rock. But it's also, to use Lyell's own descriptor, reproductive in its primary role in the construction of the land masses of future continents via the transportation and slow accumulation of debris in lakes and seas. And water's erosive power is most visible in the dramatic energy of waterfalls, as Lyell illustrates in his set piece on the Niagara Falls. I'd like to turn now to Tennyson's poem, The Princess, and to Michael Taylor's reading of the linguistic similarity between Tennyson's construction of the scene in which Ida and the prince contemplate the cataract in the important geological expedition of the poem, and Lyell's description of Niagara Falls in his 1845 travels in North America. Writing about the princess, Taylor argues that, apart from this episode, there seems little actual Lyellian thinking in the poem. Having read the poem myself as heavily investing in a teleological view of creation, I agree with Taylor that the Lyellian scene at the cataract seems an anomaly. In my previous readings of the poem, I've argued for the influence of the Scottish evangelical geologist Hugh Miller, whose geology was steeped in a strong conviction that all inquiries into nature revealed a divine teleological narrative. But Taylor's evidence for the influence of Lyell on this scene at the cataract, which unfortunately I can't show you, I don't have the time to show you in this particular paper, is wholly convincing. And so I'd like to extend Taylor's reading by suggesting that Tennyson evokes Lyellian geology in this scene for the purpose of reconciling Lyell's seemingly meaningless cycles of geological change with a linear narrative in which human meaning and divine purpose is restored. To show, in other words, that despite the terrible vision of unrecorded non-human time that Lyell's writing evokes, the Earth's history, the Earth's story rather, is imminent. It has in fact already been written by, in the terminology Lyell is apt to use, the author of nature. Lyell's chapter on the Niagara offers a hugely expanded vision of time. Excuse me a minute. Speaking of the Niagara crag, Lyell writes, how much more enormous a duration must we assign to many antecedent revolutions of the earth and its inhabitants? Many have been the successive revolutions in organic life, and often has the sea been converted into land and land into sea since that rock was formed. Taylor points out that Lyell read the Niagara as a geological clock. The falls of Niagara teach us not merely to appreciate the power of moving water, but to furnish us at the same time with data for estimating the enormous lapse of ages during which that force operated. The cataract on the Niagara, Lyle goes on to write, has been slowly eating its way backwards through the rocks for a distance of 7 miles. Thus, we may turn to the ravine and behold therein a chronometer measuring rudely, yet emphatically, the vast magnitude of the interval of years which separate the present time from the epoch when the Niagara flowed at a higher level several miles further north across the platform. The cataract of the Princess, as Taylor suggests, can be read as embodying a geological time. And Taylor goes on to argue, Tennyson's metaphor is still more complex. Lyle's Niagara embodies 2 clocks, or rather a clock with 2 hands, one turning very much faster than the other. The river flows in human time, to be sure, but the cataract's upstreamward erosion measures geological time, the cataract's location marking the present. And of course, it is while contemplating the cataract that Ida expounds her teleological transcendentalism to the prince. Let there be light, and there was light. 'Tis so, for was and is and will be are but is. And all creation is one act at once, the birth of light. But we that are not all, as parts, can see but parts, now this, now that, and live perforce from thought to thought, and make one act a phantom of succession. Thus our weakness somehow shapes the shadow, time. Here, Ida's confrontation with the cataract signifies a confrontation with the present. The cataract itself marks the visible site of dramatic erosion in the present. But it also offers her a teleological perception of past and future, a perception of creation as unfolding in the present, but prefigured in its entirety by the intelligent but inscrutable mind of a divine creator. The trigger for Ida's argument for teleology is the cataract read as a geological clock. Her was and is and will be, which are all nevertheless one act, are embodied and predicted or preordained in the cataract's figuration, the past in the rock above and beyond the falls that constitutes a landscape in which the past is buried, the present in the cataract itself and its ongoing erosive actions, and the future which unfolds in the process of transportation as the river delivers eroded materials downstream in the reproductive operation that creates the future lands that will be. The cataract reveals these distinct parts, but it also, in a strangely tangible way, shows the whole, shows all the parts to be one act at once, as happening and existing all at once in the present. This perception is intrinsically Lylean. It chimes with Lyle's uniformitarian axiom that the present is the key to the past. The cataract in the present enlightens the past as it allows the geologist to extrapolate backwards to visualize the landscape of the past. But as well as being the key to the past, in uniformitarian terms, the present is also the key to the future, as processes now in operation allow the geologist to predict ongoing change as continual and uniform. In Lyle's uniformitary way of seeing, the geologist usurps divine knowledge in his ability to know the past and to know the future, to know how the future will unfold. But Ida reworks the uniformitarian way of seeing, claiming it to be proof of God's plan. What was crisis for In Memoriam and for Maud is balm for the princess. As the poem's wider geological frame, drawn from Miller's, as I would read it anyway, Miller's natural theology, safely encompasses Lyell's uniformitary present in a teleological narrative that speaks of intelligent design beyond the ken of mortal minds. Lyell ends his chapter on Niagara with sublime gusto. The geologist, he writes, may muse and speculate on these events until, filled with awe and admiration, he forgets the presence of the mighty cataract itself and no longer sees the rapid motion of its waters, nor hears their sound as they fall into the deep abyss. But whenever his thoughts are recalled to the present, the tone of his mind, the sensations awakened in his soul, will be found to be in perfect harmony with the grandeur and beauty of the glorious scene which surround him. For Ida too, who speaks with kindled eyes, geological speculation on the cataract results in the dramatic scene, natural scene, falling away to a vision of Lyellian timelessness, where the cataract's clock of past, present and future becomes a mere phantom of succession. Recalled to the present, however, the sensation awakened in her soul pertain to the perfect harmony of the whole. But the cataract is not only a geological clock, it's also a dramatic example of the destructive and reproductive character of water erosion. As the past and present is continually destroyed, so the future is created in what Lyell calls the reproductive effects of running water, where water erosion delivers the materials that give birth to new continents of the future. From the scene at the cataract, Ida and the prince continue. We rode a league beyond, and o'er a bridge of pinewood crossing came on flowery levels underneath the crag. Crossing the bridge over the river which represents the flow of time, they enter the Elysian lawns of a classical timelessness. From here, the geological expedition moves upwards and, as Taylor shows in the logic of Lyell's geological clock, backwards in time. From here, the company set forth to climb, to scale the crag, hammering and clinking, chattering stony names, and engaging with the distant past that, in its turn, will be destroyed as the cataract eats its way into the future. Fittingly, the poem's comic structure, poem's comic structure, the sublime is followed by the ridiculous. As the poem moves from Ida's encounter with Lyellian geology to the scene in which the prince, posing along with his male friends as women, attempts to sing maiden-like as far as I could ape their treble, and then on to Cyril's bawdy rendering of a careless cavern touch of Moll and Meg, and strange experiences, unmeet for ladies. The scene ends with Ida's angry exit and her fall from the bridge into the river and her subsequent rescue from the river by the prince. The head, the princess, oh the head, for blind with rage she missed the plank and rolled in the river. Out I sprang from glow to gloom, there whirled her white robe like a blossomed branch wrapped to the horrible fall. By entering the river, Ida is entering the maelstrom of the present time. A more playful reading of this episode might be to see Ida's sudden immersion in the river's cold water as encoding an instance of aquatic shock treatment, a water cure designed to kill the mad idea that is her feminism. Immersed in the present, as a result, as Taylor suggests, Ida enters the human world and abandons intellectual interests for marriage and for motherhood. By entering human time, Ida allows the future to unfold in reproductive terms. And by entering the river close to the horrible fall, she enters the present at the point of her initiation into the physical world of sex and death encoded by the fall. And from the time of her fall, Ida begins to reform her own ideas, her refusal to honor the marriage pact, her refusal to play her small part in the inscrutable one act. She descends the mountain in parallel with the river that marks her journey into a reproductive future in human time. So where for the speaker of In Memoriam Lars endless cycles of time compound the sense of an empty materiality, a darkened earth devoid of Hallam, devoid of meaning, the princess frames Lars' cycles within a teleological narrative of forward, purposeful progress. And intrinsic to this rehabilitation of Lars' geology is both Ida's vision of the cataract's clock and the river's foregrounding of the healthy reproductive function of water erosion in the geological system. I'd like to turn to Maud now, as this highly sensual poem resumes the Lylean model of destruction and reproduction. However, here the emphasis is on the amorous possibilities of water erosion, as set up early in the poem in the lyric of part 1, section 4, where the speaker wonders, wherefore cannot I be like the things of the season gay, like the bountiful season bland, when the far-off sail is blown by the breeze of a softer clime, half lost in the liquid azure bloom of a crescent of sea, the sapphire-spangled marriage ring of the land. I think there's something amiss in my PowerPoint here. I'm sorry about that. Many of you know the poem anyway, I know. Okay, so the speaker here expresses a fervent longing for abandonment, to give the self over to the exotic action of the waves. The crescent of sea is the sapphire-spangled marriage ring of the land. Its inward tides denude the land, reducing it to a rhythmic, tidal ebb and flow in the fluid and luxurious action that will ultimately waste it. The marriage ring represents the longed-for fulfillment of sexual desire, but it also demands a relinquishing of the self to the slow, erosive power of water as the marriage ring encroaches erotically on the land. It's an ambivalent expression of both desire and fear of surrender. The far-off sail, which is blown by the breeze of a softer clime, offers the imagination the uncharted and unlicensed freedom of the sexual fantasy. The sail drifts in the brilliant azure bloom of the sea, and the self is half lost as the tonal nuances of identity are overwhelmed in intense, lush colour. I'm so cross about this. I can't do it now. For some reason, one line isn't where it should be. So. In this scenario, the borders that define the self are dissolved into the seductive aqueous forces that offer the possibility of reproduction, but at the expense of death. The speaker can't be like the things of the season gay because he himself is out of step with the seasons. He is detached from nature because in this most Lylean of Tennyson's poems, where the speaker's madness is a manifestation of Lars' non-progressive geology, he is alienated from the narratives of natural theology that give nature a human story. An issue that is foregrounded in the poem by the speaker's continual misreading of the message of nature. Thus, for Tennyson's mad, solipsistic speaker, the self is all. There is no meaning outside of the self. Therefore, it cannot be subsumed by nature. It must subsume nature into itself. The lyric sets up connections between water erosion and sexuality, which help when reading the significance of the rivulet, which is mentioned 5 times in the poem, in all of its sections, tying them all together. In keeping with La's emphasis on the extraordinary power of even a small rivulet, the idyllic charm of the poem's rivulet belies its erosive energy, making it a deceptively destructive force operating within the pastoral landscape. It has a political dimension too, as it runs through the entire landscape of the poem, rising at the high hall, flowing downwards, crossing from the lake to the meadow and onto the wood and down to the sea. Like the cataract's clock in The Princess, the rivulet's erosive power marks the passage of time. Thus, to follow the stream upward is to return to a feudal past represented in the high hall, while the future unfolds downstream in the rivulet's reproductive materials are deposited at lower levels. Read in political time rather than geological time, the rivulet represents the dissolution of landed power. It operates as an erosive force on the hierarchical landscape, dragging down an older order as the wave drags down the maddened beach in the formation of a new reformed world represented in the loathed squares and streets of the great city sounding wide. The rivulet first appears just before the speaker's proposal to Maud. I heard no sound where I stood, but the rivulet on from the lawn, running down to my own dark wood, or the voice of the long sea wave as it swelled now and then in the dim grey dawn. The rivulet is heard but not heard. The speaker hears no sound but the rivulet, implying that as a marker of geological process, the rivulet's uniform and consistent actions are virtually imperceptible. Its sound, however, is distinguished from that of the waves, and yet the two are part of the same system of destruction and reproduction, but the speaker fails to make that link. The rivulet is also key to the poem's message of love, as it carries within it the rose which, halted temporarily in its passage to the sea, is read by the speaker as sent from Maud to invite him into her rose garden. Rivulet crossing my ground and bringing me down from the hall, this garden rose that I found, forgetful of Maud and me, and lost in trouble and moving around, here at the head of a tinkling fall, and trying to pass to the sea. O rivulet born at the hall, my Maud has sent it by thee, if I read her sweet will right, on a blushing mission to me, saying in colour, in odour and colour, ah, be among the roses tonight. The rivulet bears in its stream the debris of Maud's own garden in the form of the rose. As such, it contains the double message of destruction and reproduction that Lyle ascribes to water's erosive and transporting function. But the speaker, light-headed, fantastically merry, reads only the message of love. He fails to see how in crossing his ground and bringing him down from the hall, the rivulet has an adversarial quality. It crosses and opposes him. It steals from him the very ground beneath his feet. It carries away the eroded fragments that make up his own dark wood, the land that is conspicuously described in the poem possessively as my ground, my own dark garden. It eats away at the precious soil, destabilizing the speaker who, like the materials carried in the rivulet, finds himself in the Madhouse canto, dragged down to lower ground, and in the logic of the rivulet as a clock, buried beneath the city streets to be part of the geological processes that construct the landscapes of the future. The speaker's self-doubt, which is figured throughout the poem, is articulated as he wonders if he reads Maud's sweet will right. He reads the rose as a symbol of love, but in this geologically figured scenario, if it represents love, that eternal element of in memoriam, then it suggests that even love is subject to uniformitarian laws, that it is, in the course of time, irrevocably transformed. The rose, in fact, is already forgetful of me and Maud, and lost in trouble and moving around, indicating the irrevocable transformation of all matter in the geological system. Just as the speaker reads the rivulet as a message of love, but fails to recognize the ruin it also embodies, he also fails to read the double message of the rose's blushing colour, as to do so would be to recall the first stanza of the poem, where the red-ribbed ledgers describe the bloody sight of the father's death. The speaker becomes aware of this misreading in section 2, when he remembers the roses in Maud's garden and almost fear they are not roses, but blood. But by the end of the poem in section 3, when there is no longer any prospect of sexual fulfillment, the original association of red with violence and death has returned in the blood red blossom of war. But the rose is also a symbol of Maud, who is Queen Rose of the Rosebud Garden of Girls. The rose itself is halted on its journey to the sea. It is lost in trouble and moving around, here at the head of a tinkling fall and trying to pass to the sea. As Ida falls into the river near the point of the horrible fall, so the rose teeters on the brink of a fall that encodes the journey into sex and death, represented by water's destructive and reproductive forces. To conclude then, it's the agency of running water that best illustrates Lyell's uniformitarian focus on the present, and that features in both the princess and Maud in the form of the cataract and the rivulet, respectively. Both can be read as clocks that indicate geological time, and both also foreground water's erosive and reproductive processes. In The Princess, the radical potential of Lyell's uniformitarian geology is diffused by the poem's use of wider teleological narratives formed from the geology of Hugh Miller and others. In this way, Ida sees the whole as she contemplates the cataract and through Lyell's sort of lens, but she's also able to reconcile Lyell's non-progressive cycles with the passage of human time and to play her small part within it. She enters the present, figured via the river, and by doing so enters a timeline and a narrative that the text shows via the extrapolation of aqueous erosion will lead to a reproductive future. In Maud, the rivulet offers the same representation of geological process, but its promise of reproduction is stalled. It can't unfold while the speaker wanders in a directionless Lyellian present. It can't unfold until the speaker can break Lyell's purposeless cycles and restore both his narrative of self and the teleological narratives that link nature and the human world with God. Thank you.